I want to tell you about the death of an empire. Not the kind of death you see in history books with wars and burning cities, but the slow, mathematical strangulation of a nation that once ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface. The United Kingdom, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, the country that invented modern capitalism, is collapsing. And I don't mean that as hyperbole. I mean it in the most literal technical sense. The UK is on track to become the first G7 nation to be downgraded to an emerging market economy. Let that sink in. A country that was synonymous with wealth, power, and stability for 300 years is now circling the drain alongside countries that never had a functioning economy to begin with. Here's the number that should terrify you. Since 2008, UK productivity growth has been essentially zero, flat, dead. For 17 years, the average British worker has produced no more value per hour than they did during the financial crisis. The NHS, once the crown jewel of British society, is collapsing under its own weight. Wait times for emergency care are measured in days, not hours. People are dying in ambulances parked outside hospitals because there are no beds. The pound sterling, which used to be the world's reserve currency, has lost more than 40% of its value against the dollar since 2008. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, are lower today than they were in 2008. Think about that. An entire generation of British workers has gotten poorer, not richer, over nearly 2 decades. Everyone wants to blame Brexit. The narrative is simple and it feels good. Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, and that was the beginning of the end. But that's not the full story. Brexit was a symptom, not the disease. The rot started much, much earlier. The UK's decline is the result of 4 decades of systematic policy failures, addiction to debt that would make a gambling addict blush, and a political class that sold out the productive economy in exchange for a financial services bubble that was always destined to pop. This is not a story about leaving Europe. This is a story about how a superpower commits suicide in slow motion, and why the United States and the European Union are following the exact same playbook. Let's go back to when things started to fall apart. Most people think the UK's problems began in 2008 with the financial crisis, but the real turning point was 1979. That was the year Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and she brought with her a revolution in economic thinking. Thatcher looked at a country that was struggling with stagflation, powerful labor unions, and declining industries, and she made a choice. She decided that the UK's future was not in making things, but in managing money. She deregulated the financial sector, crushed the unions, and allowed entire industries to die. Coal mining, steel production, shipbuilding, all of it was sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. The idea was that Britain didn't need to manufacture goods anymore. It could be a service economy, a financial hub that would generate wealth by moving capital around the world. And for a while it worked. London became one of the 2 most important financial centers on the planet, alongside New York. The city of London, that 1 square mile of ancient streets and towering banks, generated enormous profits. The UK's GDP grew, unemployment fell, the stock market soared. But here's what nobody wanted to talk about. All of that growth was built on debt. The UK wasn't getting richer by producing more goods or inventing new technologies. It was getting richer by borrowing money and inflating asset prices. Households took on massive mortgages to buy homes that were appreciating faster than wages. Banks lent money to anyone with a pulse. The government ran deficits year after year, confident that the City of London would always generate enough tax revenue to cover the bills. This is what I call the first layer of the trap. When you abandon your productive economy in favor of financial services, you become dependent on asset price inflation. You need housing prices to go up. You need the stock market to go up. You need corporate debt markets to stay liquid. Because if any of those things stop, the entire economy seizes up. The UK had traded the stability of a diversified industrial economy for the fragility of a finance-dependent one. And when the financial crisis hit in 2008, that fragility was exposed for the world to see. Northern Rock, a British bank, was the first major casualty of the crisis. In September 2007, customers lined up outside branches to withdraw their money. It was the first bank run in the UK in more than a century. The government had to step in and nationalize the bank to prevent a complete collapse. But Northern Rock was just the beginning. By 2008, the entire British banking system was on the verge of implosion. RBS, Lloyds, HBOS, all of them were insolvent. The government had to inject more than £500 billion into the banking system to keep it alive. That's not an exaggeration. £500 billion. At the time, that was equivalent to about 35% of the UK's entire GDP. Now here's where the story gets really dark. The government didn't have £500 billion just lying around. So it did what every government does in a crisis. It borrowed. And the Bank of England, the UK's central bank, did something even more dangerous. It started printing money. They called it quantitative easing, which is a fancy term for creating money out of thin air and using it to buy government bonds and corporate debt. Between 2009 and 2021, the Bank of England created more than £800 billion through QE. That's more money than the UK had printed in its entire history before that point. The logic behind QE was that it would stimulate the economy. By lowering interest rates and pumping money into the financial system, businesses would borrow more, invest more, hire more people, and the economy would recover. But that's not what happened. Instead, all that newly created money went straight into assets. Housing prices skyrocketed. The stock market doubled, then tripled. The rich, who owned most of the assets, got spectacularly richer. But the productive economy, the part of the economy where people actually make and sell things, barely budged. Productivity growth stayed flat. Wages stagnated. The UK had created a two-tier economy. If you owned assets, you were winning. If you had to work for a living, you were falling behind. This is the hidden mechanism that most people don't understand. Central bank money printing doesn't create real wealth. It creates inflation, and specifically, it creates asset price inflation. The people who benefit are the people who already own assets, property, stocks, bonds. The people who get hurt are everyone else. Savers see the value of their cash eroded by inflation. Workers see their wages buy less and less. Young people get priced out of the housing market entirely. In 2000, the average UK home cost about 3.5 times the average salary. By 2020, it was more than 8 times. That's not a market. That's a Ponzi scheme. And the only way to keep it going is to keep printing money and keep interest rates at zero. But here's the mathematical impossibility at the heart of the entire system. When you print money to prop up asset prices, you have to keep doing it forever. The moment you stop, asset prices start to fall. And when asset prices fall, the entire debt-fueled economy collapses. The UK, like Japan before it, and like the United States today, is trapped in what economists call a debt spiral. The government has too much debt to ever pay it back. The only way to service that debt is to keep interest rates low and keep printing money. But keeping interest rates low and printing money causes inflation, which erodes the value of the currency and makes everyone poor. It's a suicide pact with no exit. Let me give you the numbers. In 2008, UK government debt was about 50% of GDP. Today, it's over 100%. That's a doubling of the debt burden in less than 2 decades. And that doesn't even include all the unfunded liabilities, the promises the government has made to pay pensions and healthcare costs that it has no way of financing. If you include those, the real debt burden is somewhere north of 300% of GDP. That's not sustainable. That's not even close to sustainable. And yet, the UK government keeps borrowing more because it has no other choice. It can't raise taxes high enough to cover the spending without destroying what's left of the economy. It can't cut spending without causing social unrest. So it borrows, and the Bank of England prints, and the cycle continues. Now let's talk about what this has done to the average British person. Real wages in the UK have been stagnant for 15 years. Adjusted for inflation, the median worker in Britain earns less today than they did in 2008. Food prices have exploded. Energy costs have tripled. Housing is unaffordable for anyone under 40 who doesn't have rich parents. The NHS, which is supposed to be the safety net that makes all of this tolerable, is on the verge of collapse. There are more than 7 million people on waiting lists for medical treatment. 7 million? In a country of 67 million people, that means 1 in 10 people is waiting for care they need right now. Cancer patients are waiting months for treatment. People with chronic conditions are being told to just live with the pain because there's no capacity to see them. And here's the sick irony. The UK is spending more on healthcare than ever before. The NHS budget has increased every single year since 2010, but all of that extra money is being eaten up by inefficiency, bureaucracy, and the rising cost of caring for an aging population. The UK has one of the oldest populations in Europe, and that demographic reality is crushing the welfare state. There are fewer and fewer workers to support more and more retirees. Now, the math doesn't work. It never worked. But politicians promised it would work because it got them elected. Brexit fits into this story not as the cause, but as the logical outcome of decades of decline. By 2016, large parts of the UK had been left behind by the financial services boom. The industrial towns of the Midlands and the North, places that used to make steel and cars and textiles, had been hollowed out. Unemployment was high. Wages were low. Communities were disintegrating. And then the political class in London, the same people who had benefited enormously from EU membership and the deregulation of finance, told these people that everything was fine, that the economy was growing, that they just needed to retrain for jobs in the service sector. The vote to leave the EU was a middle finger to that entire system. It was a vote against globalization, against immigration, against the idea that financial services growth in London was good for everyone. It was economically stupid, yes, but it was emotionally understandable. The problem is that Brexit made everything worse. Leaving the EU meant new trade barriers, new regulatory costs, and a collapse in business investment. Companies that had used the UK as a hub for European operations started moving to Frankfurt, Paris, Dublin. The financial services industry, the one sector that was still generating real wealth, took a hit. The pound crashed. Inflation spiked. And the government, in a desperate attempt to prove that Brexit could work, started throwing money at problems. They borrowed even more. They cut taxes in the hope that it would stimulate growth. It didn't. Growth stayed flat. Debt kept rising. The UK was now trapped in a doom loop. It needed growth to service its debt, but it couldn't generate growth because its productive economy was dead and its financial sector was shrinking. Let me take you to a specific moment that crystallized just how bad things had gotten. September 2022. Liz Truss had just become Prime Minister, and her government announced a mini-budget that included massive tax cuts funded by borrowing. The reaction from financial markets was immediate and catastrophic. The pound plunged to its lowest level against the dollar in history. UK government bond yields spiked. Pension funds, which had bet heavily on low interest rates, were on the verge of collapse. The Bank of England had to step in and start buying bonds again to prevent a complete meltdown. Liz Truss was forced to resign after just 49 days in office, the shortest tenure of any British Prime Minister in history. That moment was important, not because of Truss herself, but because it revealed a fundamental truth. The UK no longer had the economic credibility to borrow its way out of trouble. Markets had lost faith. Since then, things have only gotten worse. The current government is trying to manage decline rather than reverse it. They're raising taxes, cutting public services, and hoping that something, anything, will restart growth. But nothing is working. Business investment is at historic lows. Productivity is still flat. The population is aging. And now there's a new threat on the horizon that almost nobody is talking about. The UK's energy costs are among the highest in the developed world. When Europe cut itself off from Russian natural gas after the invasion of Ukraine, energy prices in the UK exploded. Factories shut down because they couldn't afford to operate. Households had to choose between heating and eating. And even though prices have come down from their peak, they're still far higher than they were before the crisis. The UK is no longer competitive as a place to manufacture goods. The only reason to invest in Britain now is if you're buying distressed assets on the cheap. Here's the forbidden truth that nobody in power wants to say out loud. The UK is never going back to being a major economic power. The era of British influence is over, the empire is dead, and the corpse is finally starting to decompose. The UK will likely remain a mid-sized economy, probably bouncing between being the 5th and 8th largest in the world, but it will be irrelevant on the global stage. It won't set the rules anymore. It won't have the military or economic power to project force. It will be a small, rainy island with some nice historical buildings and a declining population. And that's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that the debt spiral accelerates, the government defaults, the currency collapses, and the UK ends up looking like Argentina or Greece, a former great power brought low by corruption, incompetence, and debt. Now here's why you should care about this, even if you're not British. Because the United States is following the exact same path. Almost every mistake the UK made over the past 40 years, America is making right now. We abandoned our manufacturing base in favor of financial services. We became addicted to debt and asset price inflation. We printed trillions of dollars to bail out banks and prop up the stock market. We let inequality explode while telling workers that the economy was doing great. We allowed our infrastructure to crumble while spending billions on foreign wars. We promised entitlements we can't afford. We let our political system become so corrupt and dysfunctional that it's incapable of solving any real problem. Look at the numbers. U.S. government debt is now more than $33 trillion, over 120% of GDP. That's higher than it's ever been outside of World War II. The Federal Reserve printed more than $5 trillion between 2020 and 2022. Housing prices in major cities are completely detached from wages. The average home in San Francisco costs more than $1.5 million. In New York, it's over $1 million. Young people are drowning in student debt and have no hope of ever owning a home. The healthcare system is a disaster. Americans pay more for healthcare than anyone else in the world and get worse outcomes than most developed countries. Infrastructure is falling apart. Bridges are collapsing. Water systems are contaminated. The electrical grid is so fragile that a bad storm can knock out power for millions of people. And just like the UK, we're trapped. The US government can't raise taxes high enough to cover its spending without destroying the economy. It can't cut spending without causing a political revolt. So it borrows, and the Federal Reserve prints, and the debt keeps growing. The only reason we haven't collapsed yet is because the dollar is still the world's reserve currency. That gives us a privilege the UK doesn't have. We can print money and export our inflation to the rest of the world. But that privilege is not permanent. China, Russia, and other countries are actively working to replace the dollar as the reserve currency. They're creating alternative payment systems, trading oil in yuan, accumulating gold. The moment the dollar loses its reserve status, the game is over. Interest rates will spike. The cost of servicing our debt will explode. We'll be forced to choose between defaulting on our obligations or printing so much money that we trigger hyperinflation. And Europe is in even worse shape than the United States. The European Union is a collection of countries with different languages, different cultures, and different economic interests, all trying to share a single currency. It's a mathematical impossibility that only works when times are good. The moment there's a crisis, the whole thing starts to fall apart. We saw it in 2010 with Greece. We're seeing it now with Italy, which has a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 140% and an economy that hasn't grown in 2 decades. Germany, the economic engine of Europe, is now in recession. Its manufacturing sector is getting crushed by high energy costs and competition from China. France is dealing with riots and political instability. The European Central Bank has printed even more money relative to the size of the economy than the Federal Reserve. Negative interest rates, which were supposed to be a temporary emergency measure, became the new normal. Banks in Europe were literally charging people to hold their money. That's not a sign of a healthy financial system. That's a sign of a system in its death throes. Japan went through this same cycle 30 years ago, and they never recovered. In the 1980s, Japan was the future. Its economy was booming. Its companies were buying up American real estate and Hollywood studios. Economists predicted it would overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Then the bubble burst. Stock prices collapsed. Real estate prices collapsed. And instead of allowing banks and zombie companies to fail and liquidating the bad debt, the Japanese government stepped in to prop everything up. They cut interest rates to zero. They printed money. They spent trillions on infrastructure projects that went nowhere. And the result was 3 decades of stagnation. The Nikkei stock index didn't return to its 1989 peak until 2024, 35 years later. An entire generation of Japanese people lived through an economy that never grew. Wages never increased. Prices never went up much, but they never went down either. It was just flat, dead, nothingness. The UK is now in its own lost decade, and it's starting to look like it might become a lost generation. The United States and Europe are following close behind. We're all making the same mistake, believing that you can solve a debt crisis by creating more debt, that you can fix an economy built on speculation and financialization by printing more money and inflating more bubbles. It doesn't work. It's never worked, and it will never work. The only way out of a debt crisis is to default, either explicitly by refusing to pay or implicitly through inflation. Either way, someone has to take the loss. And in every historical case, the people who take the loss are the savers, the workers, the middle class. The people who benefit are the people who own hard assets and the people who are close to the money printer. This is why the UK story matters. It's a warning. It shows you what happens when a country chooses short-term political expediency over long-term economic sustainability, when it sacrifices its productive economy on the altar of financial services, when it promises benefits it can't afford and borrows to cover the gap, when it prints money to paper over the problems instead of facing them head on. The UK is the canary in the coal mine, and the canary is dead. But here's the thing that makes this all so much worse. It didn't have to be this way. None of this was inevitable. The UK could have maintained a diversified economy. It could have invested in education, infrastructure, and technology. It could have reformed its welfare state to make it sustainable. It could have resisted the temptation to turn London into a casino and the rest of the country into a wasteland, but it didn't. The political class made a series of choices, and those choices have consequences. And now an entire generation of British people will pay the price. The same is true for the United States and Europe. We still have time to change course. We could start by admitting that our current economic model is broken, that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, that you can't promise everyone everything and expect someone else to pay for it, that you can't print your way to prosperity. We could restructure our debt, even if it means taking painful losses. We could reinvest in productive industries instead of financial speculation. We could reform our tax systems to stop rewarding rent-seeking and start rewarding actual value creation. We could rebuild our infrastructure, fund education, and invest in the technologies that will define the next century. But we won't do any of those things, because they're hard, because they require short-term pain for long-term gain, because they would require politicians to tell voters the truth, that we've been living beyond our means for decades, and now the bill is coming due. And no politician who tells the truth ever gets elected. So instead, we'll keep borrowing, keep printing, keep pretending that everything is fine until one day it's not. And when the system finally breaks, when the debt becomes unpayable and the currency collapses and the social safety net disintegrates, people will act shocked. They'll blame immigrants or globalization or whatever convenient scapegoat is available. But the real reason will be simple. We knew this was coming. We saw it happen to the UK. We saw it happen to Japan. We saw it happen to every empire in history that tried to finance its decline with debt and money printing. And we did it anyway. The UK is becoming poor because it chose to become poor. It chose financial services over manufacturing. It chose asset price inflation over wage growth. It chose to prop up zombie banks instead of letting them fail. It chose to promise benefits it couldn't afford. It chose to borrow instead of reform. Every step of the way. There was a choice, and every time, the UK chose the easy path, the path of least resistance, the path that kicked the can down the road. And now, there's no more road. The UK is at the edge of the cliff, and it's about to go over. The United States and Europe are standing right behind it. We're making the exact same choices. We're following the exact same playbook. And we're going to get the exact same result. The only question is how long it takes. Will it be 5 years? 10 years? 20? Nobody knows. But the math is clear. The debt is unsustainable. The promises are unpayable. The system is breaking. And when it does, when the UK is downgraded to an emerging market, and the dollar loses its reserve status, and the European Union fractures into its component parts, historians will look back at this moment and wonder why we didn't see it coming. But we did see it coming. We just didn't care enough to stop it. This is the story of the UK's decline. It's a story of hubris, greed, incompetence, and denial. It's a story of how a global empire shrinks into a small, irrelevant island. But more than that, it's a story about what happens when a society chooses comfort over sustainability, when it values the present more than the future, when it believes that the rules of mathematics and economics don't apply to them. The UK thought it was special. It thought it could financialize its way to permanent prosperity. It was wrong, and we're about to learn the exact same lesson.